You're listening to Speaking Sidemount, the podcast where we talk all things sidemount diving, from equipment, skills, techniques, and sidemount diving expeditions to interviews with some of the world's top sidemount divers. Whether you're new to sidemount, been sidemount diving for years, or just want to know more, this is the place for all things sidemount. I'm your host, Steve Davis. Let's get wet. Hey, welcome back to Speaking Sidemount. I'm Steve Davis. Let me start with an apology for the delay in getting this episode to you. We had everything from work schedules, international time zones, and technology conspiring against us getting this episode done, but I'm really happy to be able to bring it to you at last. This week's guest is Sandra Clopp. Sandra is an exceptional diver, instructor, adventurer, and role model for aspiring divers. I seriously enjoyed our discussions and the depth of thought and practice she has put into her growth as a diver and teacher. She walks the talk, and by that I mean she hones her skills through regular practice. She seeks out and forms relationships with mentors from whom she can learn and follow. And then ultimately she travels the world enjoying adventures that enrich her own diving. In this episode, Sandra and I discuss how she got into diving and sidemount diving, how seeking out cave diving instruction benefits your diving at all levels. We talk sidemount boat diving and introduce how we are diving the KISS Sidewinder from boats. We talk sidemount setup and contrast Florida and Mexico style sidemount diving, and we talk at length about Sandra's upcoming training and her work as a KISS ambassador. All this and much, much more on this episode of Speaking Sidemount. Sandra, welcome to Speaking Sidemount.
Thank you for having me on, Steve.
That's a pleasure. Now, great to have you join us. Now, I know this time of the year you have a massive travel and work schedule, so thanks so much for giving us some of your time to share. To get us started, can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into diving?
Sure. I started diving about 20 years on spring break in Mexico, and I tried it. I loved it. And then I studied abroad. I tried it again, and I studied abroad again, and I was able to afford doing the class in South Africa, studying there as a college student. So it was just something that I had enjoyed sort of when I was traveling. And after college, I went off to Thailand to teach English and found myself on Phi Phi Island. And I just never left. I became a dive master. At the time of my life, I was 24 years old. I was living on an exotic island, and the lifestyle was amazing. It was not the lifestyle I was raised to live, but I was loving it. And when I came home, instead of going to law school, I decided to live in New York City, which is about an hour away from where I grew up, and do my instructor training there. The reason for that was when I was in Thailand, I noticed the people that were in the water that did a better job with their students. They were in something called trim. They were in control of themselves. The students, everyone had good awareness. And I asked them what was different about them. And the guy from Holland replied, well, our water is really cold. We need to train in dry suits, and we need to keep our students close to us. So that was the first time I really learned anything about trim and buoyancy. So while I was living here, it was the only tech shop in Manhattan called Village Divers. So I was going out on the local boats, and I was diving in double tanks and in a dry suit. And as the years went on and I was enjoying teaching, I was just doing it sort of to stay active, to keep my skills up. And I got more and more into tech diving. From there, I went through the trimix route on open circuit, and then I started going down to cave country. That's when I was switching over to sidemount. Whatever I thought I had learned about sidemount on my own, I realized I was grossly mistaken when I started going down to High Springs. My first cave instructor, Reggie Ross, spent a lot of time until 8 at night trimming me out in my sidemount rig. And that's when I ended up first reaching out to Ed Sorensen, because I thought the SMS 75 might have been a better fit for me than the rigs that I had been diving and that Reggie was tweaking for me. So I stopped cave training. I went and I spent some time with Ed. And then I came back, I finished my cave training. And at that point, everything I knew about diving had started to change. Everything from the caliber of the divers that are teaching cave diving, it's a lot higher than people teaching recreational, and a lot of wreck divers. There's some great wreck diving instructors out there, but right now, I mostly only take ongoing education from cave divers, with some exceptions, of course. And then from that, it just progressed. Once your trimix open circuit, I started going into rebreathers. And then from there, you just kind of start collecting rebreathers.
It's an expensive pastime, huh?
It can be. So I fell into the KISS units. They're very easy to maintain. They don't break down on me. They're easy to fly with. So now I just have a growing collection of KISS rebreathers, including the Sidewinder, which I demoed with Ed, and I just fell in love with it. It was just a demo. I wasn't supposed to buy one and bring it home. And of course, I bought one and I brought it home.
Yeah, wow. I've just actually, a lot of that resonates with me as well, because my background was, I was a dive master at quite an old age. I was in my 40s already by that stage, and I've been doing a lot of diving, but I had no idea what tech diving was. It was when I actually saw some cave divers, Steve Bogarts, Steve Martin, those sort of guys who were specifically Sidemount divers too. I started to realize, wow, there is a whole nother level that you can explore. And I think you're right. The level and the standard of cave instruction tends to be higher than everywhere else. There is exceptions to that. Of course, there are some fantastic rec and other tech instructors. But if you were going to generalize, then I think that's a true thing to say. And certainly when you go and train with someone like Ed or Patrick or Marissa Eckhart and James Draker, all those guys who are out there cave teaching all of the time, you really get an idea of what the level is, don't you?
Yes.
As I mentioned in the intro, you do a massive amount of dive travel. I mean, how do you fit all of that in? And can you share some of your favorite dive locations?
The secret is don't have a real job in corporate America. So I used my degree at one point and I did work in finance. So I've always had this balance of working and saving and spending and traveling. Yeah. So the key is when I'm here like 6 months a year, I'm really working 2 jobs. Like I'm teaching on weeknight evenings, and then on the weekends, I'm in Manhattan. So it's easy to get work in whatever it is you want to do, be it finance or anything else. And then half the year, when it's really, really cold out, it's too cold for me to be outdoors teaching on the weekend. So this is when I do my own personal travel. Sometimes I teach in different states, the warmer states. I also teach ice diving, but this year it was canceled from black ice. So I was supposed to be doing that this weekend. So here I am in Manhattan, basically just doing pool work on my rebreather to just keep my skills sharp for when I go do all my instructor training.
Awesome. Yeah, I want to talk about that a little bit later on, because I think there's a lot for us to personally cover there, given we're both Sidewinder divers as well. You dive a whole lot of configurations. You talked about starting back mount, then going to side mount, and of course rebreathers. What factors drive your choice of what you're going to dive on a particular dive, and how does side mount fit into that?
Sure, that's easy. The rebreathers I love for myself, and I need to keep my skills sharp. So if I'm not teaching, then I want a rebreather. Once I get the license to teach rebreathers, I can then wear that rebreather for any class where it wouldn't affect the class, like, teaching dry suit, the checkout dives for decompression procedures class, things like that. But for right now, I'm on open circuit. So what am I going to wear? Well, I still do teach open water. My time is available to whoever takes it. And to those open waters, I just had them today before the pool. We did a total of 9 hours classroom work over 2 days. So when they hit that water, we've already reviewed everything from trim, buoyancy skills. They've been practicing mass clearing in the shower, because those are going to be my side mount divers later this season or next season. Those are going to be my ice divers. Those are going to be the people that come out on the boats, right? And they're going to be trained really well from the start. They pay the same as any other class. It's per day, per time, but I'm going to make them really, really good. So for them, I'm going to wear a single back mount tank, which I only really wear in open water class. Then when they pass that class, they see me in that equipment. And then it depends if I'm teaching a side mount class or back mounted doubles. And if I'm not, if I'm teaching dry suit, I can take my choice. So when the gear isn't focused on what tanks I'm wearing, I can do things like, if I haven't been in doubles for a while, I'll wear those to keep the skills sharp. And then maybe I'll add a full face mask so I can keep that skill sharp, because that's nice to have for ice diving, and be on my comms, pick your knees up. So the tanks really depend on what I need to stay fresh on. If I have a lot of students and all my single style tanks are out to side mounters or single tank divers, then I'll rock the back mounted doubles.
Do you work independently, or do you work through a shop in Manhattan?
I'm on my own now. When Village Divers sold, friends of mine bought it. They turned into Gotham Divers. So they're the only other shop. They dive locally. They teach technical diving. They're great guys. And because I travel so much, they have families they need to come home with. I don't. So I get on a plane. I go down to Mexico. I make sure my cat's taken care of. And I go off and I do some exploration, or I take another class for myself or whatever. So I send a lot of people, as many as I can, their way. Just to support the local shop, try and keep them open. They're the ones that filled my auction for my pool session today. So I operate on my own, But, I try and work with my other local people, like a community, as much as I can.
Yeah, I have a similar thing here. So I worked independently for a long time. The law here makes it a little tough to do that because we have to all be audited. But I have a local dye shop, and for the same reason, even just from the point of view of just rubbing shoulders with people in the local community, I think it's really, really cool. And of course, they're the people you get to go diving with locally as well, aren't they? So when you go out diving, boat diving in the Northeast, what about that? I mean, I talk a lot about dive Sidemount everywhere, so it's kind of what I do. But not everyone sees it that way. I mean, especially people who've dived a lot of other configurations. So if you're going out boat diving in the Northeast, I'm assuming you're twin seat rebreather rather than side mount.
That's an interesting question. I do have back-mounted rebreathers. So if I take the Classic, it's a back-mounted unit. I'm still side-mounting my bailouts in the sense that, like, I clip them on with hard attachment point up here, like they do in Florida Cave Country, because then that way when I put the bungee on and I jump off, I can have my tanks already bungeed. So I can't put the bungee on with no clip and then walk. And then if I'm setting the hook, then I need to jump off that boat. Everything needs to be ready to go. And then I'm just dropping down into the ocean with the anchor line in my hand to tie it off. So the thing is, everything needs to be sitting properly. The Sidewinder on the X Deep, I think that would be fine. I could jump in because if the cans are off, then the loop is sitting awkwardly. So on the SMS 75, I need to kind of put the cans in position and get in the rig a certain way to have it sit there. I have the machine now on the X Deep. I'm getting used to it on that. And that comes down to side mounting off a boat, because when I put it on and I'm getting ready to crew and I'm getting myself ready, then when I jump off, everything needs to be comfortable and in order, because it's go time. I'm going down to the wreck or the ocean floor, and I'm going to find a tie-off point.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the really cool things about the Sidewinder too, isn't it? Because, I mean, effectively, you've just got your offboard dill and your bailout is just two side-mounted cylinders, isn't it? So if you can connect them to your chest harness and bungee on and jump straight in. So one question there, because I'm kind of learning this right now. I've done a lot of side-mount boat diving. I can don on the boat, I can don on the water. I dive 12-litre steels here. And it was a little bit of a struggle to get the 12-litre steels on the boat sitting there. I need to kind of perfect that. I just got hold of some 7-litre cylinders, which are really, really rare here, but I've got some now. So I'm looking forward to trying them. I mean, what do you use when you're doing these dives?
So it depends what undergarments I have on. I have 2 different dry suits. And so today, my thin dry suit to use with the thinner layer, that's getting repaired, that's leaking again. So I took my larger otter dry suit that I usually put the weasel undergarments underneath for colder water. And now I'm going to be bringing that to Mexico next week. So I have to just weight check everything with whatever combination I'm using. It needs a little bit more weight than my other suit, and I know that. So I took it to the pool tonight, and I've just figured out how to weight it and trim it with a Sidewinder and an X Deep with that combination of dry suit and undergarment. So what tanks am I using? It's coming down to how much weight do I need, right? Sidewinder with aluminum tank in Mexico, I don't need any weight. It's nice to have a trim weight, but do I need one? I do like to use the trim weight just to trim out, but in terms of overall weight, I don't. But if I add thicker undergarments, then I need some weight. And if you're going to add weight, then why not add it in the form of a tank?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. It fits the concept of having a balanced rig, doesn't it, where you're using cylinders instead of weight as well as your cylinders. Obviously, the other factor might be the gas volumes that you require for the particular dive. Are you normally diving 40 cubic feet? It would be close to 7 litres, or are you diving for the larger steels, 85s or something similar?
I have steel 100s. I've got 2 different kinds of them, and they both have slightly different buoyancy characteristics. So even steel tanks, you have to look at the buoyancy characteristics of those too. From using them from bailouts, ideally they should stay full. And if they didn't, I could always let some water into the dry suit or the rebreather. The key is, like, I don't like to overweight myself. So I just have to take into consideration how many layers am I wearing. If I go up to Canada and I'm wearing the otter and the weasel, and then I had both my heaters cut out on me in Canada last winter. So I added all the merino wool undergarments that I could, all my running stuff, and I needed 32 pounds just to sink with the Sidewinder and bailouts. So then where do you put that weight? All that weight has to go somewhere. The Prism 2 has that weight plate that you can put it, but then where do you put that amount of weight so you're not too head heavy or foot heavy, right? And then on the X Deep, there's the spine, and then the dripstone plates are really nice. You don't have to zip tie weights to where you need it for the trim. When I go different parts of the world, they have different tanks available for a bailout. So sometimes they have LP50s. Sometimes they have aluminum 80s, sometimes they have steel tanks. So I just have to kind of take a look at the range of tanks. They have really short, stubby steel tanks. Do I want to use those? And then I have to take out the chart that I have in my phone, which tells me the brand of tank it is and all the buoyancy characteristics of them. Because I need to know before I go in the water, how is the tank going to be in the water? How many pounds negative? If I breathe off that tank, how much positive force is it going to have?
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, I've got a very old spreadsheet that I've used for that for a while as well, but I can see you've taken that to another level. So that's awesome. Hey, one question that comes out of that, one thing with a Sidewinder that I know can be an issue is diving it in cold water. How have you found it in ice diving?
So when I've been ice diving, I've been teaching. So I've been on open circuit. This weekend, I was actually supposed to go have fun with Gotham and ice dive with the Sidewinder and try that out. But I have been in very, very cold water in the low 30s up in Canada. The machine, it performed pretty well, but I also had it up there before they came out with the heated cans. So with the heated cans, I preheat it. If I'm doing a shorter dive, like an hour or less, I would preheat it and then jump in the water because it's less electronics I have to worry about working underwater. If I'm going to do a longer dive, I would leave it connected. But if you're in water that cold, you're usually not doing more than an hour dive or decompression. More things can go wrong when the water is colder, and I tend to not be in it for that long. So usually preheating the cans works. That's when I would start to dump the scrubber a little bit sooner. Like if it's 6.2 pounds of scrubber, don't push it to like 6 hours, which might be okay in warmer water.
Sure. No, that makes sense. I've got the syntactic foam. There's no way I'm going to be ice diving in the near future anyhow. So I probably am Fahrenheit are going down into the 50s, but wouldn't be going below that. So I don't think there's going to be a big issue for me, but that's just really interesting to know. So thank you. You mentioned instructing, you mentioned you teach everything from open water. I mean, what's your philosophy in terms of dive training? You touched a little bit on what you got out of Thailand when you were there in terms of the importance of trim and buoyancy and also the tech diving focus. But what do you try and incorporate in your courses that make a little different from others?
So I teach trim buoyancy and team awareness from the start. And I don't want to say that's how I learned to teach or that was my idea. That really came from all of my cave diving instructors. The way I learned to teach and the way I teach are completely different. I've changed my course structure down to having a notebook with the most common issues they have so I can show them what I want them to fix. And we go over that before we get in the water. And I just keep them together and I keep them in trim. And this is really how training is done in cave country. So I've really grown and developed as an instructor in my part of the world by going down and learning from cave instructors, how they're teaching classes, taking classes from them, observing them teaching, learning the different configurations that they're diving. So that's changed the way that I approach teaching and how I teach.
Yeah, one thing I covered in the last episode with Roger Williams was how positive the influence of being a tech diver is on you becoming an instructor. So what I'm saying by that is if you're a tech diver first and become an instructor second, that can be a really, really good path to go. Or if you've already become an instructor, backfilling with some tech training, such as cave training, can be really positive. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's just the development of a diver and a person in general. You know, diving is a skill and teaching is a skill. So I started off recreational and just getting into basic tech when I started teaching. Then I grew as a tech diver on my own. And it wasn't until years of doing that where I really decided that I would start to teach it. You know, back mounted doubles was just a tool that I was given and told to use when I did my instructor training. And I was using it off the boats. And it just reached a point where I decided to start doing decompression myself, to do one long dive instead of two short ones. And after doing that for years, that's when I decided that I would start going for the tech instructor endorsements after I had had a lot of experience. And then the same thing with cave diving. I got into cave diving for myself, but the more time I spend in Florida and Mexico, the more I enjoy it. And now I'm starting to shadow classes for that.
This is speaking side mount. So let's hit a bit more on side mount for a moment. I mean, what do you think it takes to be a good side mount diver?
I think it takes a lot of practice and really honing in whatever gear configuration you have first. So, you know, that means your particular side mount rig to your particular exposure suit or pluralized suits, what tanks you're using. But see, then all this changes because if you're trained with just steel tanks and then you go off to another part of the world and now you need to do it with aluminums and then off a boat, or you rock up somewhere and you want a one mount day one, how do you know how to do all that? each rig is going to handle steels and aluminums very different, and it could get just downright dangerous. If you're a steel tank diver and you rock up to Mexico and you think you're going to slap on multiple aluminum tank stages, no, your steel tank rig is not set up for that. There are some rigs which are developed, they can handle both really well. One of them would be the X Deep. I can go back and forth between aluminum steels with no problems. The SMS 75, I loved it. It's still my baby. I have it attached to my Classic right now. But to make it work with aluminum tanks, it's just that. If you look at the construction of it and how it was developed to handle steels, I can add lower attachment points and sliders to it. I can make it work with aluminum. So when I watch the videos don't lie. The tanks A-frame more, Why do they do that? It's just down to everything about how the rig was constructed. And it was constructed for steel tanks in Florida by one of my mentors, Ed Sorensen, who put a lot of work, thousands of hours, over 3,000 hours, making it from the 100 into the 75. And it's a beautiful rig for what it does, right? And then if you look at where did the X Deep come from? That came from Patrick down in Mexico, years of work on that, and then trying that in different environments around the world with different tanks. So it's just the way that it's constructed that it's able to hold both steel and aluminums and go back and forth with that quite easily.
Yeah, I love that. I dive the X-Deep Style 2.0 tech, and I, like you, have very little change that I need to make between aluminum and steel tanks. I dive steels all the time in New Zealand in a dry suit. I'll go to Truck Lagoon later this year, and I'll be there, and aluminum cylinders, up to 4 of them. It's a minuscule change that I need to make, if anything.
Correct. It's minuscule to a degree. But the thing that needs to be taken into consideration, if you learn to fly these things with steel tanks, has your instructor covered the buoyancy characteristics of aluminum tanks, right? So you're going to start off, there's a little more weight in the tail, and then when you get down to around 2,400, you've got to move the slider down. And that's an extra skill. If all you do is dive steels and you're not used to moving the tanks down, or how do you feel where they are, then you're going to have some sloppy tanks, basically. And then torque. They'll torque the tanks a little bit more. They'll have it on the stem, the bungee on the stem, to torque it more, and that'll help hold the bottle in place. If you video a tank that the bungee is giving it proper torque, that bottle won't be bouncing around as much as one where you've just put it on the valve of an aluminum tank. But with steels are heavier, right? So you don't need as much torque. And then when you clip it off, it's most likely going to stay there. But again, some steels can get a little bit floaty in the tail, and you might have to move that a little bit. So some of the rigs can be used with different kinds of tanks, but it's the training. It's going back and forth. And then where do you start adding bottles? Like, how do you clip off the bottles? Based on where your primary tanks are.
Yeah, exactly. I kind of learned the other way around. I learned to Mexico on aluminum, and then unfortunately really had no idea what to do when I went back to Northern California and jumped into a dry suit and steels and didn't even know which one. I mean, this was many years ago now, but there was nobody to help me. So it was really a pretty tragic experience, except the good part about it is I had to figure it out. The tech hadn't been invented yet, so I was on the Classic. Look, I figured it out, but it took some time, and it wasn't a lot of fun for a little while there. So I agree. If you cover that on a course and you talk about different characteristics and what you might have to do. And even now, I mean, I was in Niue Island, not last year, the year before, but I hadn't dived aluminum or aluminium for a while. And I'd made sure I videoed every dive. I went back, had a look at it. And I think the guy in the dive shop I think he was sort of super impressed, because he hadn't had anyone who does that, who videos themselves, says, okay, I need to look at my rig at the end of the dive and make sure that I can make some improvements for the next one. And, I actually quite like the feeling of aluminum ones. As you say, when they torque and pull into your body, they really do become part of you. So when you move, they move. And I like that feeling. I think it's really cool. Sandra, I know you have an interest in the development and setup of side mount rigs. We just talked about the Hollis SMS 75. We've talked about the X-Deep Stealth. And I know you have an interest in the development of them and how they're set up. Can you share a little more on your thoughts on different rigs and how you set them up?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. So I think one of the main things to consider is that you have to look at each rig, who developed it, why it was developed, and what equipment they're using, what type of environment they're using. All flows together. So, in Florida, there's high flow, it's colder water. Undergarments, people, they need a little more weight, and using the steel tanks can work over there. When you go down to Mexico, it's hotter, the water's warmer, you're wearing less layers, you need less weight to sink. And aluminum tanks, they just lend themselves to that environment and just the way that cave diving sort of grew up down there. They all had an interest in aluminum tanks, and that's what they were using. So the rigs were built with these tanks in mind. To me, that's a huge part. You know, the guys that are down there spending thousands of hours making these rigs and doing the changes on it, it's all trial and error. It just comes out of what environment they're in and why. Mexican caves are super, super fragile. So they need a rig where you can, if you have aluminums, we know they get floaty as the dive goes on. So how do you easily move them to a lower attachment point or use sliders? I have a bag of different sliders that my students can use in class. If you're using dry gloves or you're not using dry gloves, how easily do they move? So each slider out there on the market has something a little bit different about it. And, you know, when I come back home with dry gloves, if I've given away my steels to a student and if I have my SMS 75, then I have to jump that clip down to a lower attach point over the H harness. That one was designed to have the H harness on it for a couple of reasons. So if I'm doing that, I want a D-ring that's going to have a slightly larger profile, or a slider with a larger profile with my dry gloves to be able to work with it.
I saw a discussion just recently on one of the Sidemount forums about having two fixed D-rings, generally low profile, versus having sliding D-rings. Personally, I use sliding D-rings all the time, and I don't think I'd have any trouble using two fixed. I am interested in your thoughts on whether you use two fixed and when you might use them versus sliding D-rings.
Sure. So part of it depends on body size. When I'm diving in really, really cold water and I add a lot of layers, I get larger. So if I was going to be using two fixed D-rings on a system like that, depending on my body size, the slider, you can tweak it a little bit more. So I'm really, really thin when I'm wearing thin undergarments and a thin dry suit. So theoretically, I could just use two fixed points, but I just have the muscle memory of constantly working the sliders. If I'm in the SMS 75, which I have set up with an H harness, then I do have to jump it over. So it doesn't really matter in that case if it's sliders or a fixed point, just because I don't really have a lot of wiggle room to be moving them on that.
And I'm glad you mentioned H harness, because I've got Ed's mods to the Stealth 2.0 on my Sidewinder rig. So I've got the H harness on there, and I hadn't dived one before. To this day, I'm still not sure whether I like it or not. I think it's pretty cool. It's certainly really neat for donning, much easier to get on, I think, than it would be if it was traditional. But that's just given me an idea. If I have to go to aluminum, dill, and bail out, then I can put a fixed point on the other side of it. So here's a tip I picked up today. So thank you.
There's pros and cons to everything, right? So if you don't have an H harness, if it's harder to get into the X deep one, you know? So for each of my exposure suits, I've been marking on the webbing, how big do I want it? Because I need it big enough where I can get my hand in to get it off, right? If it's too tight, then it's really a struggle to get in there. So with the H harness, it's inarguably a lot easier to get into and out of. But if you're using aluminum tanks, now you have that strap there that you got to kind of unclip the tank and jump it over to another attachment point. It might be a little more difficult to get into and out of it. If you're doing it all the time in the same suit, it's quite easy. You know, it's only when I'm changing my different exposure suits and I'm adjusting the length of it, I have to make sure that I've left it the right size.
Sandra, you've trained both in Sidemount on the KISS Sidewinder with Ed Sorensen, let's call it Florida style, and with Patrick Woodman, Mexico style. They're both absolutely top shelf divers and instructors. How would you compare and contrast these styles?
I would say a lot of the styles come down to the environment and the type of tanks used. So in Florida, they're using heavy steel tanks, and that becomes the weighting system. You're diving your weight. And then you can trim out by moving the cam band up and down. In Mexico, it's a little bit different. Everybody's using aluminum tanks, and there's no flow there. So basically, with the aluminum tanks, you need to add your weight along your spine, and then you need to figure out how to trim it out. That becomes a little complicated because the tanks are going from being tail heavy to tail floaty if you're using the tanks. Obviously, for a rebreather, hopefully you don't need to. When you're trimming yourself out, in Mexico, Patrick likes the philosophy that you're using your core muscles and you're not just using trim weight placed. So he likes to do a lot of finless exercises, and that's possible to do that in the low flow down there. There's a lot of body control and a lot of stillness. In Florida, we always have water movement. There's a lot of flow. We need to pull ourselves into the cave, so we need to touch the cave to get in. So a lot of the things that are different between them. It's coming from what tanks they're using and how the environment is shaping how they dive. That's part of their philosophy. And then you have two different, very intelligent brains in two different parts of the world who are developing these rigs. So they're both creative men, they're intelligent men, and they're coming up with different ideas on how to approach creating these. So Ed likes to put on a shoulder dump, which I really love that idea. I dive with dry gloves in very cold water. I'm very small. It's really hard for me, even without gloves, to get back and to reach the butt dumps, even having moved them over so I can reach them between the cans and the bottle. And, in very cold water with lots of layers, losing dexterity, I just like to have the shoulder dump up here. Then there's the argument, well, what if that fails? Because that's up high. Well, my answer to that is I have a redundant bladder. And I like that because sometimes I'm wetsuit diving. And I like to know that I have the redundant bladder there in the ocean. So for me, if that one goes, I've got another bladder there. The other thing is the H harness. Ed used to be a bodybuilder, very large frame. And the H harness is a little bit easier to get into. It's a learning curve when you have the harness that's not the H and it comes down to the hip. But then the benefit with that is sliders, aluminum tanks, open circuit. When I go open circuit, it's easier to just move one slider down than have to move attachment points. I know it's muscle memory, but again, I'm diving in very cold water sometimes. And so to avoid things with dry gloves, like having to move things around, it just makes it a bit easier in that sense.
And I think one thing for people like you, and I'll put me in the same boat even though I don't dive cold water like you do, is that I have to be able to dive a lot of different environments. So I am diving reasonably cool water in the winter here, and steel tanks make up a big part of my system. And then there are times when I go to the tropics, for instance, where I'm diving tropical water and aluminum tanks. And so that's really important. And then there's some places which are all between. So it's been really important to me to have something that can transition easily between lots of different environments and be able to make that happen. Now, I know Patrick does do that as well, so it's quite interesting. But then, he's a different frame guy to us as well, right? And I think your arm length has a big part to play in it as well. Can you reach around to a butt dump or not? And I've found with the cans, there's no way I can reach around, right? And even getting to the drop attachment points is a little bit of a challenge. So getting to the butt dump just, I don't think would be possible. Given all of the different environments that you dive, where have you ended up with your own setup, or do you have multiple setups?
I do have multiple setups, but I constantly fly back and forth to train more and more with Ed and Pat. And I'm constantly changing my rig, as are they. The way they attach the Sidewinder to it, they do it slightly differently. And I sort of am coming out with a hybrid of how both of them like to use their rigs. So each one of them has great ideas. They both built some beautiful rigs at developing the SMS 75, put over 3,000 hours of work changing the SMS 100 into the SMS 75. And now he's worked very hard on the Katana 2. And then Patrick, countless hours, I'm sure thousands of hours developing this X-Deep system. So over time, they change, they develop, they keep coming out with new products. So I just kind of pick and choose different things that I like from both of them. And I need to make it work across all different environments, boats, the ocean, cold water, everything.
Yeah, that makes sense. I say this a lot. I don't know if the word smorgasbord means much to a lot of people, but let's call it a buffet. I kind of treat the world as a buffet, and I just walk along, look at ideas and take what I like and leave behind what I don't. I did learn some great things from Ed. And interestingly, I was saying this in the last episode with Audrey Cadell, I've started using a toddy clip for my long hose to clip that off. And one of the reasons for that was the clip that I was using before allowed the long hose to hang a little bit too low when I'm diving the Sidewinder. So the toddy clip enables me to keep the long hose, the second stage, really, really close to my chest D-ring. So I've started diving that now. I don't know if I'll keep diving it, but I certainly love it. So that's an example of grabbing an idea that's kind of a little bit out of left field from what I have been doing and applying it to my current setup. What are some of the best tips you think you've learned? You mentioned to me off mic that you'd gained a lot from your discussions with Jill Heineth and other great divers. I mean, what are some of the best things that you've been able to learn and incorporate in your diving?
I've learned stuff from all of my mentors. So Ed Sorensen, Patrick Widman, Jill Heineth, Mike Young, everybody that's just spent 10 to 20 years building rebreathers, diving them, teaching. They have a lot that you can learn from each one of them.
I think one of the things I tend to do is when I'm around people like that, I tend to be extremely observant of the way that they dive and the things that they do. Because I find if you're really closely observing someone, let's say Mike Young, for instance, and we're diving KISS rebreathers, It's really worthwhile watching how Mike sets himself up, how he conducts himself before he gets in the water, while he's in the water, when he gets out of the water. I found the same with Ed. I found the same diving with many of the others I have, Tom Steiner, Audrey Cadell, is just really making sure that you pay attention and don't find yourself looking around at the scenery all the time, because you can learn a lot from just observation.
Absolutely.
You mentioned that you're going back to Ed to do some more training on the KISS Sidewinder, and I think you are with Patrick as well. Can you share your thoughts on the unit, the KISS Sidewinder? And this is kind of me being a little bit self-indulgent, of course, because late last year I did my own training, but I'm really interested in your thoughts on it and how you dive it.
Absolutely. So I think the most important thing is, where are you placing the cans, which Ed and Pat have put a lot of thought into. They both do it slightly differently, but the main thing is the positioning of them on the sides. Mm-hmm. So you have to look at what the Sidewinder is. It was originally developed as a back mount unit, the Spirit. Mike Young actually split the cans to the side. He didn't do that for the caves. All the cave divers love this thing, so they can squeeze into any little rabbit hole that they can. But it was actually developed for KISS ambassador Josh Hoatling. He's an American vet, and he's missing his leg. So it's harder to balance with a back mount unit. So Mike split the cans. But the counterlong now, instead of being along the side, like most side mount rebreathers, what you have is it's positioned behind the lung centroid. So what that means is it ends up giving it a fantastic work of breathing due to low hydrostatic pressure imbalances. Mm-hmm. So if you have a counterlong, which is more down along the side or your hip, then it's not running right behind the centroid of your lungs. And then when you're changing positions in the water column, that's going to lead to more hydrostatic imbalances, which increases the work of breathing. The work of breathing increase is also going to lead to higher carbon dioxide levels and just general discomfort. And then in terms of resistive work of breathing that's created by how the machine itself is shaped, the overall work of breathing is so good that I think any kind of resistance, just by having it to go through those 90-degree turns, like down into the cans and back into the lung, it's allowing the exhaled gas to dwell in the scrubber and give it sufficient dwell time. So overall, it breathes well in all positions. Straight upright, you get a little chipmunk cheek. It's a little bit difficult. I wouldn't want to stay in that position for too long, but I don't have to bail out when I'm coming up a vertical restriction. I've never gone up one that is so long that I felt like I needed to bail out. That has to do with having two cans. So if you take the Shepherd, which Mike developed for sump divers, and we needed on the Exploration and Cozumel to fit through this really tight, we call it the cheese grater restriction, we had to nix one of the cans. So the Shepherd is a pendulum rebreather with just one can, and then the counterlong, which goes over your belly, similar to the Sidewinder, which is behind the back. That one, when it's missing the second can like that, it becomes so difficult to go straight up. When I had all the camera equipment, I just had to kind of come back, switch to open circuit for a minute just to go up the vertical part of it. And with the Sidewinder, I don't need to do that. So that second can is definitely aiding in work of breathing, having the placement of that on the other side of the body.
That particular vertical part of your dive profile, what's the depth change on that?
The depth change for the cheese grater, I mean, it's just a small rabbit hole. I'd have to look at my dive log for the specifics. It's probably between like 10 to 20 feet of a drop. It's not that far. It's just a little level change.
Yeah, because it's quite interesting in my training at Jackson Blue. I mean, we are going from 30 meters. I work in meters, so 100 feet. And I know that section where you come through and come back up towards the exit there, that must be a 10-meter change there, if not a 15-meter change. And that's part of the bailout drill, is to go up there and bail out and do it, which is obviously not a problem. But I didn't experience any issue whatsoever going up there on the unit. It was fantastic. And to be honest, I didn't even feel any change at all. I was obviously focused on managing the ascent, but yeah, it felt great.
And that's the chimney in Jackson Blue?
Yeah.
Right. That's not quite 100% vertical. There's a slight incline to it. And that makes a world of difference, It really does. And I've been keeping up with my finless pool practice stuff in advance of going down to see Patrick. He asked me to do 48 hours of finless hovering. And going in a complete vertical position on the Sidewinder is really where I feel it. When you have a slight incline, it's really hard to sense any difficulty in work of breathing.
Right.
And some of this is also coming down to, again, Ed and Pat are putting the cans exactly where they should be along the side. If you move those cans, you would have some hydrostatic imbalances because you're moving them. The whole breathing apparatus when it becomes farther from the centroid of the lungs, it's going to make the work of breathing increase. And so the can placement is huge. That's why going to somebody who's put so much time into getting it right is super, super important, because you can't just take the Sidewinder and slap it together and think it's going to have a great work of breathing, because it won't. It has to be very precise how you're hooking it up and connecting it and where you're placing the cans in position to your body.
Yeah, and I guess it's just coincidental. They tend to be extremely streamlined there as well, because they're sitting right on top of your side-mounted cylinders, right? So they're effectively just behind your shoulders. Yes, they're a little bit higher, but not very much higher than the highest point of your back. Again, going through some kind of restriction, and then which I had a little play at, was just terrific. You know, you didn't feel any issue whatsoever. And so for you and I mean, we are diving in a lot of different environments. So let's talk a little bit about how you're diving at, Ed and Patrick's traditionally caves. They did maybe a little bit outside of that, but not very much. But we're doing a lot of diving in other environments. So talk about the Sidewinder for ocean diving in particular and boat diving.
Sure, absolutely. I'll start off with sea caves. To fly out to the Philippines, say, Anilao, there's a really cool sea cave. So you're getting on this outrigger boat, you're going out into the middle of the ocean, you're rolling off a boat with it, and then you're dropping down and you find a sea cave. So there's a couple ways to get it on. When it was on the SMS 75 and the cans had to be underneath the wing, I really had to kind of lay down and wiggle into it. So when I sat up, the loop would be straight and not at a funny angle. With the XD, it doesn't seem to have that effect. I seem to be able to just kind of have the rig sitting however I want it, put it on, and then the cans and then the loop are going to sit how I want. So that would be boat diving in order to get to a cave. And then just in terms of open ocean boat diving, because it has such a great work of breathing, we have currents in the ocean, right? And I know there's flow at Jackson Blue. But if I'm working a little bit harder in the ocean due to the water movement that I'm fighting, it's good to start off with a great work of breathing. Because the harder the work of breathing, the more carbon dioxide retention, and it all just compounds. So just because it's such an easy rebreather to dive, it works fine for me in the ocean.
Yeah, I had a similar experience. I haven't dived it a lot yet, so this is just my very early thoughts on it. And I went on a liveaboard for 2 days out to the Poor Knights Islands here in New Zealand, which was just amazing. Had 30-meter plus visibility, fish life everywhere. It was brilliant. And I had exactly that experience. We dived Northern Arch, has fantastic fish life. So there's normally 2-meter long kingfish in there. They're just awesome to watch. However, there's a current flowing through there that is sometimes too much to swim against, but most often it's just okay to swim against. So you can make a little bit of progress and move yourself through, and then you turn around and come out with a flow similar to a flow cave. And I found on the Sidewinder, I was working reasonably hard to get myself in there. But again, I didn't have this issue of feeling as if I was getting a lot of CO2 retention, and certainly not that much more than I would have got on open circuit. I will say I think it would have been easier on open circuit doing that swim. But because I'm still streamlined, I'm still basically in Sidemount, so my actual configuration is streamlined, then I found it reasonably good for that. And I had a lot of fun. It was cool. And the same thing with you on the boat. The biggest issue I think I had personally was trying to put on big steel cylinders. And when I say big, for me is 12-litre cylinders. That was a little bit of a challenge with some of the hose lengths and so on that I was working with. I think I've now got some 50 cubic feet, 7-litre steel cylinders that I'm really looking forward to diving, because I think that's going to be my tool of choice for most dives from a boat, unless I need more bailout. You mentioned you're diving the XD, so talk a little bit about the mods that you've done to the XD. How far have you taken it in terms of Ed's mods?
So like I said, I do have the redundant bladder. I do want to get the shoulder dump that Ed puts onto it. And then I'm still in between putting into an H how Ed has it, or leaving it on the hip how Pat has it. So, when I fly back and forth, I end up kind of modifying the rig how each one of them has it. And they're both clipping on the cans slightly differently as well. They seem to be sitting very cleanly in the water on both of them, using both of those methods.
Great. One thing I want to ask Patrick, I know he started to do a mod about putting the counter lung inside the X-Deep stealth harness. Did he progress that, or is that still something he's working on?
I don't think I'm allowed to talk about that right now, but I can say that if you look at his style of diving, he's very minimalist with the weight, right? Partly it's shallower caves in Mexico as well. And so if you're overweighted, the buoyancy change becomes exponential when you have more air to have to deal with. So he's diving very minimalist weight. So if he bailed out, now you would have to pick up a rock, or here's the thing. If you bail out, your rebreather's no good, right? Therefore, if you put a little bit of water into it with the KISS units, I mean, worst case scenario, you're changing out your cells and your wiring harness, right? It's not an electronic unit in the sense that if you bailed out and you started to get floaty, you could pick up a rock or put a little bit of water. The thing is pretty flood resistant. Ed said in his podcast with you that he was trying to flood it, trying to flip around. They did come out with a water drain on it if a person's concerned. But the thing is, the counterlong has such a large area for the water to go that it becomes very hard to flood.
So I was talking to Ed yesterday, just asking him a few questions, and he kindly helped me out post-course. And I told him I'd flooded the loop on the first dive I did after 4 months back in the water and just stupidly left the DSV open. That's all it was. And I thought, oh, crap, I'm going to have to get out of the water. But look, there's a drill for that, right? So I thought, okay, let's do the drill. So drained the exhale hose into the exhale can. And once the water had stopped gurgling, I thought, okay, let's dive this really tentatively, see what happens. If it's going to be a problem, I'll bail out and call the dive. It was not a problem whatsoever. So I was able to complete the dive. I didn't notice any greater work of breathing. Obviously, at the end of that dive, I'm changing the saw, but it was interesting. So I got out of the water, opened the cans. Sure enough, the right can or the exhale side was wet. The counterlung was reasonably dry apart from what you would normally expect, and the inhale side was completely dry. So admittedly, I don't know how much water really went in because I noticed the mistake pretty quickly, but I know for sure some water went in because it was gurgling, right? So that was really cool for me to be able to see, number one, how flood tolerant it was, but also number two, to see that that drill really works where you're draining the exhale hose into the can and you can either continue to dive or if you're not comfortable, of course, you bail out. All right. Was there anything else that you wanted to cover?
Sure. So there is a new prototype Sidewinder that Mike's been working on. It's completely self-contained. It can be used as a redundant rebreather under a back mount rebreather. You don't have to plug into bailout because it's got underneath the cans. Think about the Sidekick, how that has the oxygen bottle underneath, right? Now on the other side, there's another one with dill, and then the whole thing is encased. Sort of like having two Sidekicks or two side mount rebreathers down your side, essentially. It's larger in diameter and it's shorter. And the shorter bed length is better for deeper dives because there's less resistive work of breathing. It stands up better on a boat than the Sidewinder does. Mike is constantly inventing. This is his passion. He had it at DEMA, so anybody who walked by the booth and got to take a look, it's still being worked on. It does have to be tested, but if people are asking and the demand is there, then he's looking into it and he's trying new things.
This particular unit, when would you look to go to this versus the current Sidewinder? What type of diving or what advantages does it have over it?
It's good as a redundant rebreather. If I know you don't like the word back mount, I think this is a dirty word on this podcast. But
Not at all.
If you had two rebreathers, right, and you wanted to start cutting out bailouts, if you trusted your machines enough and you worked with the setup, practicing it enough. Now, if you can make the Sidewinder not have to go to external diluent source, so it's got it on board basically.
Interesting. Well, that's something else to look out for over the coming years. Thanks very much. When you see Patrick, say hi for me, and same with Ed. Yeah, and enjoy yourself. You're going to have a ball, huh?
Yeah. They're both the best.
Yeah. Different shades are the best, right? As I said, you're so lucky, I think, to be spending the next few weeks doing that. That's awesome.
I'm super lucky. I super love the fact that, I can go work with both of them because they're both super busy. And I just feel like they probably have so many instructor candidates just like lined up at the door, So I'm just happy to get their time and to be able to meet both of them over the years.
Well, again, you should be proud of that yourself, huh?
Yeah, I love that. And being a KISS ambassador is something I'm proud of too, just to be able to work closely with Mike Young and KISS Rebreathers, see what they have going on, go exploring with them, being able to shoot all his inventions with a camera rig. So far, I've been able to photograph 4 different prototype rigs, the Shepherd, the Abyss, the prototype Sidewinder, and a front mount one that he's been working on that he had in Arkansas last year. So it's so cool just to be able to look at what he's developing, explain how is it working. The Shepherd is a pendulum rebreather, and each one has their own features that make them interesting. The Abyss has a variable 4 to 7 pound scrubber. So just to watch how he's doing the build, how he's diving it, how he's explaining it, and then I can photograph it. I feel like I'm photographing sometimes a zoo animal in a good way. Because I look at him and I'm like, what is this contraption that you've come out with? It's really cool to be a part of that. So I got really lucky with that one that I can sort of fly around and dive with him and learn what it is he's inventing and photograph it. I'm a photographer, so I love to shoot anything that's really cool and different.
Thanks very much.
All right. Thanks for having me on your show. I love listening to the series. So it's an honor to be on it. Half the people that have been on your show have all been my mentors at one point or another. And it's just really cool to listen to them speak. They're all just amazing people.
Yeah, they are.
In general. Yeah. I mean, on a personal level too.
And the thing I love about this too is all of these people are some of the world's greatest divers, but the people that they train who go out and then go and do their own thing have the opportunity to sort of evolve and grow into really what they are. And you're one of those people. And so I kind of feel as if there's another wave of great divers who are already really good, but are now going out and doing things that bring them into that echelon, you might call them. Yeah, I'm excited to have you on the show. I think it's awesome. And I want to have more people who are doing great things. I've just got to find them. All right. Well, thanks. I have to go and do my next mission, which is close up the shop.
Hopefully cool to dive someday.
Oh, we'll make that happen.
Absolutely.
Yes, Sandra.
Cool. All right. Thanks, Steve.
Well, hey, thanks for joining me on this week's episode. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. It was just amazing to be able to talk to Sandra and get the depth of content and information that she shared with all of us. I learned a whole lot myself, and I hope you got a lot out of it as well. Now, a couple of quick notes. If you want to learn more about the fundamentals of sidemount diving, go to www.sidemountpros.com store, and there you'll find my book, Sidemount Fundamentals, which has all of the things that you need to cover the fundamentals of sidemount diving. And on top of that, I've got a short clip there from Sandra where she talks about a Facebook group that she set up called Tech Diver Singles Dating, where single tech divers can get together, meet, and look for opportunities to travel together. So it looks like an amazing initiative. So if you're a single tech diver, I highly recommend that you pop over and have a look at that. Thanks again for joining me, and I'll catch you again in the next episode of Speaking Sidemount.
So, Steve, I started a group called Tech Diver Singles Dating. It's on Facebook, and it's basically open to people that are into any kind of tech diving, cave diving, shipwrecks. There's open circuit, and they like to travel. And the point of the group is that we post in it, and you can just post an upcoming trip and then see if anybody wants to go down and join you wherever it is you're going.
Oh, that's so cool. So what's the link for that? How do we find it?
It's just a Facebook group. It's called Tech Diver Singles Dating.
Okay, cool. If you like, I can post a link to it in the podcast notes. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Steve.
You've been listening to Speaking Sidemount from www.sidemountpros.com. If you like the podcast, please subscribe and consider leaving us a 5-star review. If there's something you'd like us to cover on the show, then let us know via our Facebook page listed in the podcast notes. Thanks again, and we look forward to you joining us on our next episode of Speaking Sidemount.